Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the first substantive session of the 5th IISS Indian Ministry of External Affairs Dialogue. My name is Rahul Roy Chaudhary. I'm the Senior Fellow for South Asia at the Institute. The session today, as we've heard from the Foreign Secretary earlier, focuses on Afghanistan and its neighborhood towards 2015 and beyond. As NATO's combat forces withdraw from Afghanistan in the next 24 months, the role of Afghanistan's neighbors and near neighbors become more important to stability and security. Pakistan, Iran, India, China, and certain Central Asian states are all expected to have greater influence in Afghanistan in the next 2 years and more. And some of these states have competitive, if not tense, relations with one another. India vis-a-vis Pakistan, Iran and Pakistan, the role of Saudi Arabia, etc. And the one thing they apparently do not have at the moment is a consensual view on the stability and security of Afghanistan and its future. At the same time as the policies of these countries impact on Afghanistan, Afghanistan's domestic challenges of governance and the Taliban impinge on these countries as well. Yet, can there be a regional consensus among these states on the future of Afghanistan? And we heard a bit about this in the keynote address that the Indian Foreign Secretary made. Will the neighborhood play an even more divisive role, possibly, and disruptive role for Afghanistan's future, or can it come together in terms of the economic issues, particularly the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline? Will that be practical or not? To discuss some of these and related issues, I am delighted to have an expert panel from the IISS and the Ministry of External Affairs of India. The first speaker, my colleague Ben Barry, is the IISS Senior Fellow for Land Warfare and leads on Afghanistan at the Institute, especially in relations to matters military. The second speaker, my former colleague and in fact my former boss in government, Dr. Arvind Gupta, is the Director General of the Institute for Defence Studies and Analyses, the preeminent defence and security think tank in India. Dr. Gupta is currently on deputation to the Institute from the Ministry of External Affairs, where he is an additional secretary level official. I've asked both of our speakers to make introductory remarks for about 15 to 20 minutes each, after which we will have a discussion. Thank you. Ben.
Thank you, Rahul. I think the Foreign Secretary made an extremely good analysis of both the opportunities to the international community and the threats that are involved with transition in Afghanistan. And he also set out very clearly India's role in assisting the country across many lines. I wouldn't quarrel with anything he said, and I'd like to complement his analysis with an analysis from the military point of view. And I'll cover the progress of security transition, the Afghan forces, key security challenges, which includes the role of Pakistan and the risks to transition, and also some key factors affecting Afghan and regional security after 2015, which will themselves affect both the UK and India. The Institute spent last year studying Afghanistan, not just the military side, but also politics, legal and illegal economies, the drug trade, Al-Qaeda, and the interests and behaviour of Afghanistan's neighbours. And we published our assessment in January this year in the IISS Adelphi book, Afghanistan to 2015 and Beyond. And quite clearly, I can only skate over the surface in 15 minutes. Of course, the plan is that the Afghan authorities take the lead for security across the country by the end of 2014. Now, the Afghans have done so for 3 tranches of districts and provinces across the country, including most of Kabul, and they've assumed the lead for special operations and for Bagram prison, as well as leading half the security operations. An Afghan authority on security now applies to almost 3/4 of the country's population. Now, there has been security progress made since the start of the US surge in 2009. Greatly improved intelligence and special forces capabilities have caused significant attrition of insurgent leadership inside Afghanistan. And Al-Qaeda capability in both Afghanistan and Pakistan has been greatly reduced. And the security gains made in the surge have not been rolled back by the insurgents. The UN, for example, assessing last month and I quote, "There has been no significant deterioration of public order or security in areas where transition has taken place." And an 8% reduction of insurgent attacks in 2011, and the UN's assessment of a 30% decrease in security incidents in the first 9 months of this year compared with last year, suggests that ISAF and the Afghan forces are gaining an advantage over the Taliban. The Afghan reintegration program has persuaded over 5,000 insurgents to lay down their arms, and there are credible reports of local popular uprisings against the Taliban, particularly in Ghazni province, but elsewhere as well. NATO continues to show cautious optimism that the improving confidence and capability of the Afghan forces means that improvements in security will endure, and declared so at the May 2012 Chicago summit. Turning to the Afghan forces, achieving the surge strength of 150,000 Afghan National Police and 195,000 Afghan National Army personnel by the end of this year is actually ahead of schedule. And I assess that the Afghan Army's capability will continue to improve sufficiently for it to be able to hold areas cleared of insurgents during the surge. NATO is particularly confident about the rapidly maturing capabilities of the Afghan Army and Police Special Forces. Now, the Afghan police capability is less advanced than that of the Afghan Army. It will continue to improve, but its ability to better the lot of the ordinary Afghan depends on corresponding improvements in the whole machinery of justice, including courts, lawyers, and prisons. And these areas lag even further behind, and this is an area the international community will have to continue with its support to Afghanistan from 2015 and beyond. Of course, significant security challenges remain. The US surge troops have now withdrawn, as have many other NATO troops, with 68,000 US forces remaining alongside about 28,000 troops from other nations. And US reductions will continue down a steady glide path, and they will be matched, if not overtaken, by similar reductions in other troops in the country. This, of course, is encouraging to those insurgents that think they can outlast the US and NATO effort. But there's an important known unknown here: the extent to which insurgents are motivated by the presence of foreign troops. Now, insurgent foot soldiers and leaders whose principal motivation is nationalist and religious resistance to infidel boots on the ground may well lay down their arms if foreigners withdraw. But I'm afraid there is little evidence that military efforts in Afghanistan or Pakistan are having sufficient coercive effect at the strategic level to bring insurgents to the conference table, let alone keep them there or force them into an acceptable deal. And it's also far from clear there will be sufficient improvement in the Afghan government and governance, particularly reduction in corruption, to neutralise the root cause of the insurgency, even in areas that have cleared and held. And balancing development with improving transparency, honesty, and bearing down on corruption, again, will be something that will be a difficult challenge for the international community up to 2015 and afterwards. There's been a lot of reporting recently of the increased number of insider or so-called green on blue attacks on NATO forces by Afghan troops and police, and it's become a major issue. Now, as a result, both NATO and the Afghan authorities have devoted considerable effort to tightening security against Taliban infiltration. But the indications are, and there's certainly plenty of material on this published by both the UK and US, that many of those attacks are not carried out by insurgent sleeper agents or sleeper cells. It's likely that exhaustion after a decade of war, as well as accumulated Afghan resentment of the NATO presence, civilian casualties, and inadvertent humiliations of Afghans are the major motivating factors. So I'm afraid such attacks are likely to continue until NATO troops withdraw from the battlefield completely. Kabul is thriving. It has only 1% of the security incidents, but those security incidents include, as the Foreign Secretary described this morning, spectacular insurgent attacks, mostly mounted by the Haqqani network. Although these and similar attacks in Kandahar and recently on Camp Bastion have been contained and then counterattacked, and in both Kandahar and Kabul, the counterattacks have been executed completely by Afghan forces, particularly Afghan police and army special forces, with very limited ISAF support. But as propaganda of the deed, these attacks have had some international success in portraying transition as failing and attacking confidence in NATO nations. Now, the ability to counter these is limited by the presence of insurgent and criminal networks in Kabul's hinterland, and there's been much less military progress in southeastern Afghanistan, including the eastern provinces that abut North Waziristan, where the safe havens of the Haqqani network are. And the US drawdown makes it far less likely that the Haqqani network strongholds in southeast Afghanistan can be cleared, or that their efforts to mount spectacular attacks can be fully interdicted. So Pakistani attitudes and actions are a key strategic factor. Islamabad's strategic interest now appears to be to facilitate a political endgame in its favour, whilst reducing India's presence and influence and preempting the worst-case outcomes for Pakistan, that is of a civil war or indeed of Pashtun irredentism. But of course, we've seen over the last year a considerable deterioration of relations between Islamabad and Washington, especially after the killing of Osama bin Laden and then the accidental killing of 24 Pakistani troops by US forces last November. That led to a cessation of US-Pakistani cooperation and closure of NATO supply lines. There are continued Afghan allegations of cross-border shelling by Pakistan, and Pakistani claims that Afghan-based arms groups are attacking Pakistan. Although tension has reduced sufficiently for Pakistan to reopen the NATO supply lines through its territory, the US program of drone strikes continues to stoke Pakistani resentment of the US and contaminate attitudes towards the US and NATO. So as well as these political disincentives to countering Afghan insurgent networks and infrastructure in Pakistan, it's also not clear the country has sufficient civilian and military security capability to further suppress Afghan insurgent safe havens at the same time of countering their own serious problem with domestic militants. Now, what does this all mean? The main conclusion of the analysis we made last year and published in January was that out of the possible futures, the most likely scenario was that Kabul would retain sufficient political and security power to be able to hold the state together in an Afghan way. Now, this didn't mean the insurgency would be defeated, rather that there would be a patchwork of security and governance, with the Afghan forces suppressing much insurgent activity in many areas. We considered that Kabul would, by a combination of political deal-making and security action, continue to hold the majority of the country. We saw the chances of a strategic peace deal between the Karzai regime and the Taliban were remote, however. Now, those are still our judgments. And in the book, we analyse a number of known strategic risks that could derail transition. And I just want to highlight two of those. The first one of them comes from one of Afghanistan's neighbours. Now, unlike the early 1990s, all of Afghanistan's neighbours actually have a fundamental shared interest in Afghanistan's stability, as indeed do Russia and, as we heard this morning, India. But a potentially destabilising regional shock would be a US strike on Iran. The consequences are difficult to predict, but at the very least could see Iran withdrawing its support from Kabul, possibly providing support, training and better weapons to the insurgents, and even directly attacking US and NATO troops and bases. The other risk is President Karzai's successor. Karzai has accepted the constitution requires him to stand down in 2014, and at the very least, there will have to be a rearrangement of Kabul's patronage and influence networks around his successor. At the worst, a new president could act in a way that decreased stability. Now, in the latest issue of the IISS journal Survival, which is published this week, there's an article about this called The Other Afghan Transition. And Michael O'Hanlon argues, and I'll just read to you the sort of O'Hanlon's introduction. The other big transition in 2014 is arguably more important than the change of military mission. When the Obama administration has talked about a political strategy for Afghanistan, it's often been referring to peace talks with the Taliban. But the real political issue is how to best influence the evolution of Afghan politics, whatever might happen with peace talks. Most important is the contest to replace Karzai. Should a warlord or corrupt actor replace Karzai, the entire mission will be in dire jeopardy. At that point, much of the elaborate planning now underway for aid and security cooperation after 2014 would mean very little. By contrast, should one of Afghanistan's impressive reformist leaders be empowered, the country could enjoy a huge boost forward. Indeed, the issue will matter well before 2014. Preparations for the election will themselves have great impact. They could either worsen Afghan fears that ethnic cleavages will be exacerbated and the threat of civil war amplified, or they could help calm nerves, inspire imaginations, and bind the country's disparate ethnic groups and political factions together. He then goes on to propose a US political strategy to help achieve this. I don't discern or hear similar thinking in the US or UK. Now, my final point reinforces the point the Foreign Secretary made, that the International Committee needs to continue to support the country from 2015 and beyond. And I've got three sort of key factors. The first one is the Afghan forces. Now, in the medium term, it might be possible or even necessary to reduce the size of the Afghan forces, and the assumption that this will happen is built into both NATO and US strategy. Now, if the security situation improves, that's fine, but it could also be driven by Afghan government finances contracting and, indeed, reduction in support from the international community. Now, the good news about reducing the size of the Afghan forces is this would potentially allow literate, numerate, well-trained and self-confident people to make a wide contribution to the future of Afghanistan. But if the Afghan economy, security and political climates have not improved sufficiently, there would be strong incentive for people leaving the Afghan forces to use their skills in the service of warlords or criminal enterprises. Secondly, what of the US and NATO footprint from 2015? Well, the most important thing will be the confidence of the Afghan authorities and their desire to exert their national sovereignty. You could see a possible future which is similar to Iraq, where the Afghans reject foreign assistance and advice. Or you could see a possible future where they insist that any foreign troops or personnel remaining in Afghanistan operate under Afghan direction. Of course, many contributing nations will be attempting to minimize their footprint in Afghanistan, particularly in terms of number of boots on the ground, reducing their people to a minimum number of advisors, principally in training bases and Kabul ministries. An example of this is the UK, where the only firm military commitment the UK has made to Afghanistan after 2015 is that it will continue to be the lead nation assisting in the building of the Afghan military academy. And that doesn't require more than about 20 British forces personnel. It may, of course, also be possible to provide fixed-wing air support required by the Afghan forces from outside the country, from bases in the region or from aircraft carriers in the Indian Ocean. And those could also provide the basis for any international special forces required to counter any residual al-Qaeda threat beyond the capability of the Afghan forces. And I don't think that we have much clarity on this yet, and that's not surprising. My third factor on Afghan security after 2015 is the role of Pakistan. Now, at the moment, the ground supply lines through the country and the practical requirements of withdrawing NATO troops and their considerable amount of equipment, the British alone require to withdraw 6,000 shipping containers between now and the end of 2014, as an example. The practicalities of that mean that many NATO nations are going to have some dependence on Pakistan just for the mechanics of withdrawal from Afghanistan. But of course, once all those NATO nations no longer have boots on the ground or substantial military contingents in Afghanistan, this dependence will be much less. So we could see many nations' strategic interest in Pakistan change, although in the light of the final part of this dialogue about UK-India relations, in the particular case of the UK, there is a factor which is the Pakistani diaspora in the UK. But you could see, for the US and many other NATO nations, their interests in Pakistan change after 2015.
Thank you very much, Ben. We'll move straight on to Arvind Gupta.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning. I want to thank the MEA and the IISS, particularly my old friend Rahul, for having brought me here after almost 10 years. I used to be here in the early 90s, and nice to see some of my friends from that era. In today's discussion, I think a lot has already been said, so I really don't have to cover this ground in detail. What I will do is, I will just take a few defining features of the evolving situation. And I want to juxtapose this transition at some length with the transition that we saw in the 90s. That was mentioned both by Ben Barry and briefly mentioned by the Foreign Secretary also. Just to see what were the reasons for Najibullah's collapse, and could there be some lessons? Is it that we are doing something better than at that time? And then I will say a little bit about, well, I think I may be able to avoid it because Foreign Secretary has already said a lot about India's evolving approach to Afghanistan, but maybe we can discuss it a little bit. The short point is that the Afghanistan, the current phase is now really nearing its end game, and we are now beginning to enter discussions about 2015, which is a period full of uncertainties, and it's almost impossible to really predict accurately what might happen. But it's universally, you see all the analysis that comes out, that is, there are tremendous concerns about the deteriorating situation in Afghanistan. Surely the diplomats, the international community has to be positive, otherwise I think whatever efforts are being put, even those will not succeed. But there is this big question mark that after 2015, whether the international community, which through a series of conferences has put together a framework of transition, whether the political will to really sustain the support, the level of support, both on the development side and security assistance, whether that will sustain or not. The ground situation looks as follows. The US withdrawal, the withdrawal of surge troops is now complete, and we still do not know whether and how many troops the US will keep in Afghanistan and in what role after 2014. Most probably there will be non-combat roles. One of the most discussed and one of the most serious trends has been that is the green on blue attacks. Over 60 ISF soldiers have been killed this year. It's not the numbers, but it is just the psychological and the symbolic advantage, importance of these green on blue attacks, which means that the Afghan soldiers and the ISAF soldiers are finding difficult to work with each other, and some kind of a mistrust and suspicion has come about. And this could be debilitating in this end game which is unfolding. And the recent attack on the Camp Bastion on September 14, in which 8 Harrier jets were destroyed. I mean, that itself, the high-profile attack which the Taliban indulged in. There's been a lot of speculation, who did it? Some people saying even perhaps it was so well organized that even perhaps the ISI might have been behind it, but it is still a matter of speculation. The Afghan National Security Forces are being built, but their professionalism and training, I think, is still not at the desired level. And General Malik in the morning did mention about the number of battalions which are trained for fighting, and this is I think only about 13 or something that you mentioned, which is a very small number. But certainly they have had some notable successes also, as the Foreign Secretary mentioned, particularly handling the attacks in March or April earlier this year. The security situation north and west is tolerable, but in south and southeast east remains a matter of great concern. The Taliban, and let's never forget that Taliban are ultimately the creation of the ISI, continue to enjoy sanctuaries and safe havens in Pakistan. Now the transition that we are talking about does not take care of this factor. That is where I think the biggest weakness, the critical weakness of all the plans that have put on paper, that is where it lies. And I think there is no really clear thinking as to how these sanctuaries and safe havens will end. Another critical weakness is that there is as yet little progress in reconciliation with the Taliban. And the Taliban, to make matters worse, also speak in different voices. There are several groups. There is no one person that you can talk to. Mullah Omar remains irreconcilable, and the more active Haqqani group also remains opposed to the talks. The drone operations in South and North Waziristan have not really been able to pacify the Taliban, and the Taliban are see that is some kind of a sense of victory. And of course, illicit drugs continue to fund Taliban insurgency, and this will remain a huge problem because the drug issue is now engulfing not only Taliban but also the neighboring countries, particularly in Central Asia. President Karzai, his own political future, 2014, another transition will take place. Whether that will happen, what will happen to that, I think will also be very crucial for the future of Afghanistan. And he remains a divisive figure in Afghan politics, because in all this talk about various conferences, etc., we often forget that there is a reconciliation to be done within Afghanistan, and that's the Pashtun and the North Pashtun groups. And there are a number of important functionaries in Afghanistan, whether it's Abdullah or whether it is Amrullah Saleh and many others, I think who are very critical of President Karzai himself. Then there is, of course, the financial dimension to the transition at Tokyo. The international community pledged 16 billion for the next 4 years, which is less than what Afghan president expected. And he quoted a figure of, at Bonn, about 10 billion per year. So I think there is a big gap between what he wants and what he is going to get, if he is going to get at all. And then, as it was mentioned, I think it was Rahul who said that there is the regional consensus is missing in Taliban, in the area. Pakistan is looking for strategic depth. Iran wants to see the back of American forces from Afghanistan. China is eyeing Afghanistan resources. Russia is at best a service provider today. If the funds can be arranged, Central Asian countries do not have the capacity to stabilize Afghanistan, although they have stakes in a stable Afghanistan. Then there is also this new Afghanistan in the making, educated youth, women. They have high expectations, and their dreams may not be fulfilled. And also, a reference was made, warlords have not really disappeared, and if the security situation worsens, they would resurface. Now, in this backdrop, let us look at the transition from when the Soviet troops withdrew and when Najibullah fell, the period of, say, 1988 to 1992. The Geneva Accords, which were signed in 1988, were really designed to end Soviet military intervention in Afghanistan, and these were guaranteed by then superpowers, US and the USSR. They were also crafted to ensure, and that's very important, the end of Pakistani interference and facilitate the return of refugees. Now, Geneva Accords succeeded only partially, in the sense that the Soviet troops withdrew by 1989, but the rest of it, I think, the deal was simply not kept. Pakistan's interference did not end. Pakistan and US joined hands, in fact, to ensure the end of Najibullah regime, which lingered on till May 1992. A few refugees did return, but most of them remained behind in Pakistan and Iran. The Afghan government submitted hundreds upon hundreds of notes to the UN mechanism at that time to say how Geneva Accords were being violated by Pakistan, but there was absolutely no impact whatsoever. In the meanwhile, the USSR itself collapsed in 1991, leaving Najibullah friendless and Mujahideen emboldened. The critical weakness of that transition was the inability to bring about national reconciliation. Najibullah had started reconciliation efforts actually even before the Geneva Accords. Najibullah's efforts at national reconciliation did not succeed at all. In fact, the UN Secretary General came out with a peace plan in 1991, which eventually led to a Peshawar Accord of April 1992, which Hikmatyar refused to sign and actually sabotaged. A Mujahideen government led by Sibghatullah Mujahidi came to power in May 1991. Najibullah faced, in fact, internal challenges when his own defense minister, Shahnawaz Tanai, teamed up with Hikmatyar and Pakistani forces to stage a coup against him in March 1990. The coup, of course, was suppressed. During 88-92, the Mujahideen forces stepped up their attacks, first attacking Jalalabad in 1988 and later capturing Khost in 1991. Pakistan's DGMI and ISI actively helped the Mujahideen in the planning of their military operations in Afghanistan. A tottering Soviet Union, which was supplying at that time $300 million worth of aid per month to Najibullah regime, eventually gave up. And in fact signed an agreement with the US in September 1991, whereby both sides stopped aid to their respective proteges. In short, Pakistan used the weakness of the Soviet Union, the high morale of the Mujahideen, the financial assistance which was coming from the Saudis and the Saudi charities to its own advantage by seeking to install a government of its choice in Afghanistan. Both Benazir Bhutto as well as Nawaz Sharif gave full support to the Mujahideen during that period, and that eventually led to the rise of the Taliban. So what are the main lessons of that period? One, the Soviet troops left without achieving national reconciliation. So if that happens, that is something negative. Two, Pakistan saw a massive opportunity to gain strategic depth in the country and install a friendly regime there, which, as I said, eventually led to the installation of the Taliban themselves. Najibullah regime, the regime at that time in power, was totally isolated when the Soviet Union stopped military and financial assistance. So if the ruling government did not get any help, I think it will lead to instability. The US and Saudi governments completely backed the Pakistani effort to bring about a regime change in Kabul. And equally important at that time, the disunity among the Mujahideen showed up immediately when Hikmatyar distanced himself from the Mujahideen-led Peshawar Council government, and in fact he started the whole series of rocket attacks on Kabul, etc. So during 92-96, Afghanistan witnessed another period of transition, which was characterized by acute disunity among the Mujahideen. So if today the Mujahideen or these Taliban, etc., are not united or they are not brought in national reconciliation framework, you will always have, whatever regime comes to power, it will be vulnerable to attacks from these people. As per the terms of the Peshawar Accord, Mujahideen handed over power to Rabbani in June 92. However, he found it difficult to reconcile with Hikmatyar. And the resultant disunity among the Mujahideen created the condition for the rise of the madrasa-educated Taliban. So, that period of transition, of course, this period, the lot that has changed. The idea is not to, push the analogy too far. But the fact remains that the presence of safe havens and sanctuaries in Pakistan that weakened the regime that was there. The disunity amongst the Mujahideen weakened the regime that was there. So for this transition, I think the nexus between the Pakistan, with Pakistani agencies and the Taliban must be broken if future stability is to be ensured. The Haqqanis, supported by the Pakistani intelligence, remain linked with Al-Qaeda, although people saying Al-Qaeda has weakened, etc. But I think this is something that, is reversible. There are so many things happening in that region which can lead to the rise of Al-Qaeda once again. Even if reconciliation with the Taliban is achieved, the potential differences with Taliban can destabilize whatever system that you put in place here. Hizb-e Islami, which destabilized the Rabbani government in the 90s, remains a wild card even today. And within Afghanistan, Pashtun, non-Pashtun political divide should also be attended to and reconciled. And the situation is made worse due to the unresolved drugs issue. So these are, in fact, the drug nexus is becoming now so big that it engulfs Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Russia. The drugs money, which is very much a part of the war economy in the region, and this is something that actually there has been no success in really dealing with this issue. The withdrawal of the ISAF troops will also increase the dependence of warlords and other vested interests on drugs, because the whole war economy which has been put in place, that will undergo a massive change. So India has to look at its options in Afghanistan against the above backdrop. Of course, India has actually already made a choice, as was mentioned in the morning. India has taken a decision to support the Karzai government by signing a strategic partnership agreement last year. however, there could be practical constraints on developing the partnership to the level of meeting Afghan government's expectations. In the foreseeable future, the Taliban will not be able to take over Kabul, as was the case last time, at least this is how I feel. This is because the international community is supportive of the Afghan government and is willing to provide at least some assistance, which was not the case earlier. But the continuity of the support for the next 10 to 15 years is what is required. It is not just for 1, 2, or 3 years. So that is, I think, the domestic support in these countries, the partner countries, for staying put or staying the course in Afghanistan, that will be critical. India-Afghanistan relationship can go beyond aid and transform itself into a comprehensive relationship. And the recent investment summit held in New Delhi is a good beginning. India's $2 billion worth of socio-economic projects have also demonstrated that India and Afghanistan have developed capacities to work together, and even in difficult conditions. But India can also start looking at the multilateral arrangements now. Multilateral efforts, namely those of the SCO. SCO is very interested in stabilizing Afghanistan. I think India might begin to engage with the SCO because there is also this India's application for a full membership of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization that is pending. And India can join some of these efforts. And India should have no hesitation in discussing Afghanistan with any of its neighbors, and even including Iran and China. In fact, with Pakistan also, I think India has offered many times to discuss Afghanistan, but it is the Pakistanis who are not very interested at this moment. However, at the present moment, the prospect of stability in Afghanistan do not look too bright. Patience and diligence, and more important, political will is called for. If the international community does not abandon Afghanistan, which happened in the earlier instance when Geneva Accords actually meant that the Afghan government, the Najibullah regime, should have been helped and people should have cooperated, but that didn't happen. If the international community this time stays put, then I think it is possible to keep the Taliban at bay. But I think in a foreseeable future, I don't think the Taliban are going to be fully reconciled. At least there will always be some groups who will not be reconciled. And whatever system that you put in place there will remain vulnerable to these depredations from across the border. Safe havens and those kind of the sanctuaries will remain important. And I think Pakistan, the role of Pakistan will remain critical. If it plays a positive role, I think Afghanistan can be stabilized. And as I said, and I'll end with that, in the entire architecture that is being built here, somehow this whole issue of safe havens and sanctuaries is not being addressed. And without that, much of what we are doing today may not be effective. Thank you, Ram.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gupta. I think we have a lot to focus on. These have been two differing interpretations, in part in terms of Afghanistan and its future. I want to sort of begin the discussion session by asking a question that relates to both these the presentations that we've heard, and that is over the commitment of the international community that we've heard. And Ben made the point about the UK's principal focus in terms of support to the military academy in Kabul, and Arvind made the point about the political will, or whether the political will actually will stay there. But the question I want to ask both of you, in the sense, is that I mean, clearly, my own sense is that there will be sort of a weakening of the political will by a number of countries. Ben talked about some of the NATO countries that may look differently towards Pakistan in that sense, but I think the analogy can also be drawn towards Afghanistan. The issue really then is that if the international community does not have the will to continue in Afghanistan or Pakistan in that sense, in the relationship, then what does it mean for Afghanistan? I mean, does it mean, and I want to draw the analogy, does it mean going back to the 1990s period that we've seen civil war emerge in Afghanistan, the Northern Alliance and the other groups, or is it something that may be less worrying than civil war, with Kabul at least holding strong, and possibly some of the other major provincial cities holding strong against the Taliban? But the question to both of you is really in the sense about if there is a decrease in political will by the international community after 2015, what does it mean for Afghanistan domestically? Civil war or something short of that? Do you want to start, Arvind?
Well, that's an easy one, Rahul, isn't it? Forgive me. Let me start with the military side. I should have said in my talk, of course, that the key actor in the military and security support is the US. Now, General Allen, the US and NATO commander, has repeatedly stated in public that he's not going to be responsible for making any plans for the rest of the transition until the end of this fighting season, which of course conveniently coincides with the US presidential election. And my sense is that an awful lot of people who might make the plans in Washington, D.C., in the Pentagon, State Department, USAID, are all waiting for the outcome of the election. From the security point of view, quite clearly the most important thing is the money to fund the Afghan security forces. Now, figures are quoted ranging between 6 and 4 billion, and Afghanistan itself, which pays virtually none of the cost, has said it will provide $500 million of its own money to this. Now, that is a lot of money, but of course it's far less money than the current progress of the war. The other thing that strikes me is that although it's big money, for many countries, their troops are in Afghanistan for complicated national reasons, including, for example, maintaining security influence with the US. Once their troops out, Afghanistan will become a much less toxic political issue, which might make it easier to continue to spend money on development and other forms of assistance. But Rahul, could I hedge my bets? Because in a sense, it depends on the Afghan conditions. You know, if President Karzai's successor commands the respect of all the different sort of major factions and ethnic groups in Afghanistan, and is a force for good for national reconciliation in the way that, despite all his efforts, President Najibullah wasn't, as Dr. Gupta has said, then you've got a very much more helpful climate. But quite clearly, the less the support, the more risk there is. My final observation on the security side is I think the US probably has a bottom line, which is no ungoverned space in Afghanistan where Al-Qaeda can put down roots again.
Rahul, the main point of my presentation was precisely this, that despite the Geneva Accords, that government was abandoned, and that led to the civil war. So if there is a weakening of the international community's political will, and not just the security is very important, but also the assistance of various kinds, capacity building, and this time it's not going to be 1 or 2 years. We have to commit ourselves for 10, 15, 20 years. Then whatever regime you put in there will be highly vulnerable. Now, exactly how it plays out, it will depend upon the power equations pan out. But look at the criticism. Actually, very few people even listen in today's most discourse. Very few people listen to what the other Afghans are saying. The non-Pashtuns, what are they saying? What is Amrullah Saleh, for instance, saying? Amrullah Saleh tells you all the time that so long as there are safe havens and sanctuaries, Afghanistan will never be stable. Amrullah Saleh and Abdullah last year managed to get a 10,000 strong rally in Kabul against President Karzai's reconciliation policy with the Taliban, because they are very scared that Taliban will come back to power. The question is not of territory, question is not of percentages here. The question is that these forces will remain alive and they can begin to, and now given the drugs, so the additional issue, drug was there also, but now it's at a massive scale. So So there are all the ingredients of a highly unstable situation available.
Thank you. The floor is open for questions or comments. I've got some names already, but please feel free to raise your hand and catch my attention. For the first person is the gentleman on the third row. Yes, please. If you could stand up, and if you could identify yourself for the rest of the members. Thank you.
Jamshed Safarov, Embassy of Uzbekistan. Dr. Gupta, you mentioned about the possible more active involvement of SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, on the Afghan problematic. In what extent do you see such involvement purely diplomatic or political diplomatic involvement as it's already happening on other multilateral fora like Istanbul process or other regional frameworks, which is, it's not a secret. Our country has some reservation and too wide formats, and we propagate more narrow approach to this. Or you look to the SCO as a possible driver for economic assistance and other wider infrastructural projects on the regional spectrum. Or you look more broader to the possible security guarantees from the SCO format. Please, thank you.
Okay. If you see the evolution of the SCO position on Afghanistan over the last few years, earlier they were not saying very much. They had then they set up a contact group, which really didn't do very much. But over the last few months, maybe a year or so, there have been a lot of discussion within the SCO, a lot of conferences, track 2, I've attended some of them. The concern about Afghanistan is very much there. But what I see is that SCO is totally lacking the capacity to provide security guarantees, which is where I think the Afghan problem. The first thing is to have a security guarantee, which the SCO is not able to do. Secondly, the SCO countries' main concern has been the drugs, which is extremely important. But again, the question of capacity of actually what can they do on the ground is a problematic. The third is the economic assistance. I think that's where they can play a big role. There is a number of projects. I think Uzbekistan is already helping Afghanistan, I think with some electricity, etc. The Chinese are investing in Afghanistan, and they have also some a number of projects lined up between Xinjiang and Afghanistan. And similarly, the other countries are also Tajikistan, etc. So, because Afghanistan is neighbor, they can certainly play a positive role. But that can only happen if there is a proper security situation. And on security front, as well as on the political front, I think, the SCO's capacities are a bit limited.
Thank you. James.
James Chirinkandat from the Institute of Commonwealth Studies. I was struck by the 5 conditions that Dr. Gupta mentioned in relation to the post-1988 situation. And what you seem to suggest is that 3 of those 5 conditions apply today. That there is a plurality of disunited Mujahideen groups or opposition groups. You have the Pakistani support for some of these groups, and you have no national reconciliation. And the implication of that is that while there may not be a decisive overthrow, as we saw in the case of Najibullah, you will still have a very unstable situation continuing. But I just wanted to ask you both about a factor that you haven't mentioned, which is how much Afghan society has changed in the intervening period, and how much, in that sense, the nature of the regime in Kabul is it sufficiently different from the situation that prevailed after the Soviet withdrawal, and how much difference that could make to the longer term prospect.
Thank you. I have several people on my list, and I'm very keen that anyone who does want to ask a question or make an intervention should do so. So I'm going to sort of take two or three at one time. The second on my list is General Malik. Thank you.
Thank you, Rahul. My question is to Ben. Ben, the composition of the Afghan army spells this, things are not stable, because General Azizullah Khan, and he is already stockpiling up in the north. And the composition is Tajiks, Uzbeks, and Hazaras. Pashtuns are not included. Now, that being the situation, when this takes place, Pakistan has all the time been talking of this stabilization or some kind of reconciliation in the composition, because the seeds are already there for destabilization. So if you could answer that. Second, Arvind, I'm totally with you. It's a comment actually, not a question, that international community has got to be in it for long term. And long term is really long term. And in that, to me, the question should be turned on its head. That is, not if Afghanistan is to be stabilized. If Afghanistan is destabilized, what happens? And keeping the 9/11 in mind, it is the constituency of the young people who have now nurtured in this last about 10 years. That has somehow to be approached. And in that, everyone has got a stake. The neighboring countries and the international community. And if that is somehow strengthened, then there is something to hang on to. Otherwise, the warlordism and loyalty is shifting, they'll continue. Thank you.
Thank you. Ben, do you want to go first and for both responses? And then I can ask you.
A full answer to both questions would probably take the rest of the morning. Starting with General Malik's point, there are the figures I have are that there are Pashtuns in the Afghan National Army, and the proportion of them roughly represents the proportion in the country. The problem is they're northern Pashtuns rather than southern Pashtuns. But there are Pashtuns in key leadership positions, including the Vice Chief of the General Staff. But we mustn't forget that it's not just the army, it's also the police, because the model for the Afghan police is they're locally recruited. So almost all of the Afghan police in Helmand and Kandahar are Pashtuns. And of course, as transition happens, the police are going to be assuming the lead. In fact, on the ground, in places in Kandahar and Helmand, where transition is most advanced, like, for example, Lashkargah town itself, it's the police in charge with the Afghan army in support, and there just happens to be a British base there. This isn't ideal, but I don't think it's quite as dark as General Malik has painted it. Where this is an important factor is I just echo Dr. Gupta's point about a peace deal with the Taliban, because the danger is a peace deal with the Taliban could be seen as disadvantaging all the other ethnicities in Afghanistan. And it's very difficult to see how a deal could be stitched together that wasn't destabilizing, and we went into this in some detail in our book. I'd just like to make a third and final point, which is about the parallel with the late 80s and early 90s. And I have to disagree with Dr. Gupta here. Safe havens are not a showstopper. There are plenty of insurgencies with counterinsurgency campaigns where safe havens have not been closed down and terminated, but the campaign has successfully concluded. An example is Northern Ireland, where the IRA's ability to utilise territory in the Republic was never completely terminated. Another one was the Dhofar insurgency in the 1970s, where the insurgent safe havens were not terminated, but a military security and political and development solution inside southern Oman actually effectively drew the sting out of the insurgency. And also the Malaya insurgency, where the residual insurgents migrated into north into Thailand, where they have remained. Because the thing about the war is this isn't a conventional military war where the opponents have to eventually lay down their arms and march off into a prisoner of war camp. It's much more sort of non-linear than that. It doesn't require the elimination of the insurgency, but it does require it to be reduced sufficiently that it no longer poses an existential threat to the Afghan state and be contained by the Afghan security forces without NATO's combat power. And of course, we've still got about 2 years of fighting still to go. So in the case of southern Afghanistan, which is threatened by safe havens in and around Quetta under the influence of the Quetta Shura, provided that over the next 2 years, security expands and also defences in depth along the border are properly constructed. And indeed, the same argument also applies to eastern Afghanistan, where we've seen considerable defence in depth against infiltration to do those spectaculars in Kabul. It has to be good enough, but you'll very rarely in insurgency and counterinsurgency campaigns see complete termination of safe havens any more than you see complete elimination of the insurgency.
I think the Afghan society certainly has undergone a lot of change, and I briefly mentioned to the young who, the women, children going to school, and young entrepreneurs coming up, and today in the era of internet and social media, they're very well exposed to the rest of the world, etc. But that only increases their expectations. Large number of Afghans, for instance, young Afghans arrive in Delhi. Almost 500 or 1,000 Afghans arrive in Delhi every single day in search of some educational opportunities or some kind of a. So the Afghan society is changing, and I think the question is whether these people will get a say in whatever deal that is being worked out, or is it going to be only behind the scene, some insurgents, some warlords, somebody pulling strings, etc. So I think one problem is that the system that is there in Afghanistan, and this is the Afghans themselves are talking about it. I mean, my analysis is really based on some critique that I have read of the highly centralized system of governance that is in place in Afghanistan, which of course flows from the Afghan constitution itself, and which has created a hugely powerful presidency. And it's not a question of saying Karzai or somebody, but the presidency itself is very powerful, and that in some sense excludes many people in terms of governance. And the relationship between the parliament and the assembly and the presidency has been highly strained, to say the least, over the last few years. They hardly talk to each other. So the Afghan society has changed, but I think they're all subject to very major disruptive forces. So they will be vulnerable. I mean, if the security situation deteriorates, many of them perhaps will leave or go some other places. So the other point about the safe havens, no, I agree. I think when we say safe havens, it's a generic term for really saying that the link between the safe havens and those who are helping them should be broken. Of course, physically, if they are there, I mean, there may be many ways of doing it, but it's the link between these safe havens and those who run those safe havens, and we know who these are. That must really be broken. But is there a political will for that?
Thank you. I have sort of several people. The next three people on my list, first is Kiran Hassan.
I'm Kiran Hassan. I'm from the Institute of Commonwealth Studies. My question is that a stabilized Afghanistan is what everybody's aspiring for after 2015. But is a destabilized Pakistan a concern for all the policymakers by that time? Because if we talk about the safe havens inside Pakistan after 2009, there have been far more attacks by these Taliban groups on the Pakistani urban centers, and that has actually made the country very, very destabilized over a period of time. And of
Pramod Kumar.
Hello. My question is actually to Dr. Arvind Gupta. Because earlier on in the morning, the Foreign Secretary mentioned about the red lines for dialogue. Now, we are told this morning that there hasn't been any significant progress in the political dialogue. Now, Dr. Gupta mentioned that the nexus between the ISI and the terrorist safe havens needs to be broken. Well, if the United States and the NATO, with all its military muscle and massive economic power over the last 12 years, has not managed to break that nexus, who and how is that nexus going to be broken? It seems to me that there has to be political dialogue, and therefore Pakistan, even though India may not regard it a zero-sum game in Afghanistan, Pakistan certainly regards India's massive intervention there with $2 billion aid as a zero-sum game. Now, unless, and that's the elephant in the room which has only been mentioned by passing, unless India and Pakistan can come to some resolution on Afghanistan as well as on the wider issues that divide them, including post Kashmir, it doesn't seem to me there would be any significant progress in Afghanistan towards a political dialogue. And since the military solution is not on, political dialogue is the only way forward. What can India and the other countries do to facilitate that dialogue? Thank you.
Ashish.
Thank you. My question for Ben Barry is that you made a reference to the potential attitude of Western powers after withdrawal at the end of 2014, and you suggested that many Western powers may take a tougher line on Pakistan, but Britain could be an exception because of the diaspora in this country. Are you suggesting that Britain is afraid of terrorism increasing on British soil if it were to take a tougher line on Pakistan? That's the question for you. And for you, Arvind Gupta, you said that Pakistan's role is critical to the evolution of a stable Afghanistan, and I don't think anybody would disagree with that. But given, let us assume, a helpful approach on the part of a civilian government in Pakistan, would such a government be able to prevail on the armed forces and the violent extremists who are based in Pakistan in terms of changing their attitude towards Afghanistan?
Let's take these three important questions together. Arvind?
Yeah, sure.
I think I entirely agree with the lady there about destabilizing Pakistan and the situation in Afghanistan and Pakistan, at least the border regions of Pakistan, it goes hand in hand. And one instability in one will feed into the instability in the other, because this is really part of the same complex. And that brings me to this other question about the army. Actually, it's the Pakistanis who have to make that strategic decision today. And voices do come out from within Pakistan also that this helping the terrorists and Taliban, etc., is not in the long-term interest of Pakistan itself. So when you say who to break that nexus, it's not going to be broken by any military force or by, it has to be really be a decision which has to come from within the Pakistani establishment, and particularly the army and the ISI. And yes, I mean, India and Pakistan can discuss Afghanistan even if Pakistan were to agree, but this will be with the civilian government, and to what extent the civilian government has a role in deciding Pakistan's Afghanistan policy, or for that matter India policy, is a very big question mark. So in the end, it boils down to the people who really run Pakistan. They have to make a strategic decision. They have to see that it is not the chimera of a proxy war in Afghanistan between India and Pakistan, which is the real thing. That is not the case, as the Foreign Secretary also mentioned. $2 billion, I beg to differ, should stabilize. It is not, if somebody sees as a Red Bull, that's a different matter. But the amount of stability it has brought to large parts of Afghanistan is notable, and you have only to go to Afghanistan to see ordinary Afghans, how they welcome today the Indian assistance, etc. And today there is a greater demand from the Afghan, both establishment and others, for Indian assistance to build capacities in Afghanistan, and that is what they're looking for. So on this, I think the decision is already there, which the people speak about the positive contribution of the Indian assistance. And I don't think because somebody says there is a proxy war going on, India should reduce its assistance. Because India has always provided assistance to the Afghan people in earlier phases also. And that's how it built hospitals, it built roads, and it built so many other things. So I think India should continue to put its money in socio-economic reconstruction, etc., particularly assisting the Afghans, and which it is doing, as I said. A lot of capacity building is being done with Afghans coming and studying in India, etc. So India is not interested, should not, and so should Pakistan not be in a zero-sum game. India and Pakistan probably should talk Afghanistan in a more sincere and serious way. But this is something which so far the Pakistanis have not come to do that. So what can India really do? India should continue. I think India has already done the strategic partnership deal with them. Perhaps more money within its own capacities it will continue to put in there. More important, I think it will also link with the people of Afghanistan, and particularly in those areas which are quite stable. I mean, Afghanistan does not simply mean the Pashtun areas. Afghanistan means in the north, in the west, and so many other areas, and I think that is going on. And India will probably also help the Afghan government in terms of training and equipment and capacity building of the Afghan National Security Forces, which is very much included as a part of India-Afghanistan strategic partnership. So I would say that it's really the attitude of the army and the ISI which has to change. Things will begin to. And India and Pakistan can actually cooperate in Afghanistan.
These are all really important questions, and can I take them in reverse order? What I said about Pakistan was not that people would have a tougher attitude, but the attitude might change because an important factor that's driving the current approach by many nations to Pakistan is the importance of those ground lines of communication. But once NATO's contingents have successfully withdrawn, those ground lines of communication are irrelevant. Now, many smaller contingents from NATO countries are for countries that don't have much of a stake in Pakistan. As to whether this will change UK attitudes to Pakistan and how much UK attitudes to Pakistan are affected by the number of Britons of Pakistani descent, well, that question's best put to the Foreign Office Minister this afternoon. I wouldn't pretend to be an expert on it. The second questioner raised the point of the role of ISI. In January, a US paper published a NATO report based on extensive interviews with insurgent detainees held in various detention facilities in Afghanistan. And as you might expect, many of these detainees were very confident and had high morale. But it was quite interesting what they said about ISI. There was actually quite a lot of resentment of ISI. There was resentment at being manipulated by ISI, but there was also quite a few of them that didn't speak about the relationship with ISI. Now, a point I made earlier is quite clearly a proportion of the insurgents who actually fight in Afghanistan are motivated by opposition to infidel foreigner boots on their soil. Now, if that motivation goes away, can they be manipulated by ISI? Can ISI manipulate someone who doesn't want to fight? I would have thought that was pretty difficult. But I wouldn't pretend to be an expert and have a definitive conclusion on the role of ISI or not. But this does link to the first questioner's question about the stability of Pakistan and the effect to which that's an important factor in the stability of Afghanistan. Well, everybody in the room is agreed it is, but I think there is a question for India, for the Indian government, and indeed the various parts of the Indian state, is what can you do to help Pakistan make itself more stable? And how could you avoid doing things that either deliberately or inadvertently might make Pakistan less stable? Well, quite clearly, the economy is an important part of this. And then military and security side. Now, it's not for me to sort of write a prescription, but it does strike me that there are many things on the military to military side promoting transparency and mutual understanding that don't appear to be going on. And the extent to which India has to bend over backwards and sort of swallow a patience pill to achieve this, of course, is a matter of judgment. And you know, the last thing you need is a lecture for me, but that's what I think the question for India ought to be about Pakistan's stability.
Thank you. Let's take the next three people on my list. The first is Colonel Omar. Okay.
I'm Colonel Umar from Pakistan, and my question is for Dr. And I have two questions. One is that you mentioned about the interest of the neighbors in Afghanistan. You mentioned the interest of almost every neighbor in Afghanistan. I would seek your comments on the interest of Indian interest in Afghanistan in terms when $2 billion in. Can you hear me?
No, can't really. Yeah. Can you? Yeah. Yeah.
What I was saying is that you mentioned about the interest of each and every neighbor around Afghanistan. In tangible terms, I would like to seek your comments on the tangible interest of Indians in Afghanistan when they have a number of conflicts without any substantial population in Afghanistan and dollars investment. This is one. The second is I would try to be as dispassionate as possible. But I personally feel that you have gone a little too far away in strongly implicating Pakistan and ISI in all the mess that is there in Afghanistan. Whereas in my personal humble opinion, Pakistan and ISI have never been in a lead role in Afghanistan ever. There are big powers, big intelligence agencies, and this substantiates the point with from the left and by Barry, that there has to be something within Afghanistan, real money and dollars won't make a difference. So with this mindset, if this mindset is prevailing in India, and since morning we have come to a consensus that the regional consensus for Afghanistan reconciliation or solution is very important. So how would we go further? I mean, if everything comes down to ISI. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The next person is Farid Popal, please.
It's amazing you go by geography.
Coincidentally,
yeah.
it's on the list.
My name is Farid Popal. I am an Afghan. Actually, I returned from Afghanistan 4 days ago. I used to be a former Afghan diplomat to this city. So thank you, Rahul, for inviting me. There are complex issues that you have raised and discussed, and each one requires quite a lot of time to focus on and answer it substantially. That will make sense. Literally, we are hopping from topic to topic without much elaboration on any one of them. But I can tell you a few facts from the ground, and I have met with two-star British generals in person, and Afghan officials, farmers, and you name it. I'm a native of Kandahar, just to clarify the trouble areas that you are talking about. For the people of Afghanistan, it is important, and I would like to mention this to Dr. Gupta, that when it comes to security and when it comes to safe havens across the Durand line, the opposition as well as the current leaders of Afghanistan, including President Karzai, are on the same page, with the rest of Afghans. So there is no division, whatsoever among them. When it comes to neighbors and making sure that we all live in peace together and promote economic activities among each other, again, pretty much everybody is on the same page. Politically, there are divisions, and everybody has its own side, and we have people who favor Pakistan a little more, directly or indirectly. We have people who favor India a little bit more, directly or indirectly, and the like. And since you mentioned the 1989, that was coincidentally the year that I returned back from the former Soviet Union from my college studies. And so having gone through that era, I recall a lot of things that are happening right now. I would like to suggest one thing. When there is such a substantial talk about Afghanistan and its neighbor, it will be suitable to have an Afghan representative next to you for credibility purposes. The other, and I would like to end it up, again, there's so much to talk about, but I would like to end up with a question. In 2006, over a dinner table, I advocated the Chinese economic involvement in Afghanistan to President Karzai. In fact, I was the only one who was pressing that issue. And my logic was that the more the Chinese economic foot is buried in the Afghan mud, the more they may serve us as ambassadors when it comes to security interests of Afghanistan in relations to our neighbors. Should we continue on that path, or shall we decrease favoritism to a particular country or neighbor in this case compared to others? Thank you.
Thank you, Farid. Thank you for your comments and that question. And let me turn to the lady who's behind that side. Yes, as the third person to ask a question. Yes.
Hi, I'm Salma Shaheen, and I just have two finger related to the questions that just raised about the Pakistan's concerns regarding the Indian strategic encirclement from the Afghanistan side and the stability in Pakistan and Indian role in it. So I just want a comment from Dr. Gupta about the Indian involvement in Balochistan as well, because these all things I think are interlinked, and we cannot actually take one thing and discuss one thing in isolation. So what concrete measures have India taken so far to reduce these concerns from Pakistani side? Thank you.
Thank you. Ben, do you want to respond, and then Arvind can respond?
I've just got one point on Afghanistan's neighbours, is although I said that a US attack on Iran could be profoundly destabilising, Iran has an important role to play. Because it's a neighbour, Iran has economic interests, it's got religious and cultural interests, and it's also got security interests and interests in stopping the drugs trade, because it itself has a problem with the drugs trade and drugs. Now, it's very, very difficult for the US, the UK, and its European allies who are maintaining pressure on Iran over its nuclear program to have any sort of meaningful dialogue with Iran about anything else. I would imagine India could potentially have an important role to play in this, because Iran regionally has to be part of the solution, as do all the regional powers.
Thank you. Yeah, Arvind.
I think it's good to have the perspective from our colleagues in the Pakistani embassy here, and also the Afghan perspective, because it adds a certain dimension to our analysis. Now, India's interest in Afghanistan is not something that is being thought about anew. There's a long, long historical relationship between the Indians and the Afghans. Between undivided India and Afghanistan, there was a huge amount of toing and froing. There's a cultural relationship, historical relationship, etc. And stability in that part of the country has been extremely important for stability in the continent, subcontinent generally. And that remains the case even today, and particularly today when we have concerns about terrorism, etc. Stability in Afghanistan remains very important. Apart from the fact that the Afghans themselves want Indian the links with India, economic, social and cultural links with India, because they feel that it is important for their own progress and prosperity. So I don't see that India and Afghanistan relationship has to be seen in the context of a prism of the encirclement of Pakistan by India. So these relationships are very old, and they will continue. The second question about there was a question about what can India do to make Pakistan stable. I think it was mentioned that despite what happened in Mumbai, and despite the fact that India remains concerned about the lack of progress in bringing those people who did that to justice, but the dialogue between India and Pakistan has gone on. The dialogue between India and Pakistan is now, in fact, had shown some progress, as the Foreign Secretary said, in terms of particularly people-to-people contacts and also the trade and so on. Now, if that is not going to stabilize Pakistan, what else? I mean, the India-Pakistan stabilization has to ultimately come not by talking, but in terms of bringing something on ground. So if there is a more trade and more people-to-people contact, I think that will generally improve the atmosphere between India and Pakistan, though it may be gradual, but I think it is a step in the right direction. And Indians do want a stable Pakistan, because that is in our interest. At least this is what our leaders have said again and again. And there should be, despite the fact that there is a concern about terrorism, but I think by and large the Indian public has gone on, and the Prime Minister himself has taken so many initiatives, and that's why this dialogue has come to this extent. Now, this question about consulates, I wonder, when you ask this question, how many consulates did you have in mind? Because most people who ask this question, they have a certain figure. Yeah, okay. The point is that we have had consulates in Afghanistan, age-old, 4 or 5 consulates that have been there for a very, very long time. But this whole narrative about consulates, with India interfering in Balochistan, etc., is something which started about 3-4 years ago. And I have seen figures 10, 15, 20, I don't know how many. Anybody who wants to say whatever number and then want to link it up with India's interference in Balochistan. Whereas none of this, I mean, so many institutes are writing such wonderful stuff on the situation in the region. Has anybody listed as to what has India done in Balochistan using those consulates, apart from the fact that there has been some kind of reporting? So I don't think that is a serious question at all.
I have the last 3 people on my list, which is just as well, because we have about 5 or 6 minutes before we break for lunch. And in the order that I saw that they raised their hands, Hamid Hakimi first. Yes, please, Hamid. A bit louder.
Okay. I have 2 comments. Thank you. I'm loud enough. I have 2 comments which I'd like to follow with a question. The first one, in the context of your remarks, Ben, you talked about the Afghan army, but I think you didn't touch on 2 major issues there. First of all, that there's always been a concentration on the number of people being recruited rather than the quality. And secondly, about the airspace of Afghanistan and the borders of Afghanistan, which are very critical for the defense of which I think the Afghan army and the police so far quite clearly is incapable. And also that a lot of the recruitment is driven by unemployment, and a lot of people from the Pashtun-dominated region especially, they join the army because they owe debts, because they're jobless, because there are a lot of males in the family, and so forth. So as soon as that's sorted, then they return to their families. So it's very hard to see beyond 2014 how, if it continues as it is, that we'll be able to maintain the numbers of the recruits. On the second point, it's about the issue of constant reference to the ethnic divisions in Afghanistan. We've had them for generations. It's an old country. But I think it's a very foreign perspective. Because if you look at Afghanistan, just the general ordinary citizens scene is very peaceful. People live with each other. But unfortunately, due to the state failure, you call it, lack of security, you call it, people had to gang up together for their own safety. So this has constantly resulted in people going to the areas where they originated. My family had never lived in the eastern Afghanistan region. I was born in Kabul. But we had to run away to Jalalabad because the civil war began. We had to go to an area where we felt safer. So if you think about it that way, I think the issue of ethnic divisions is a diversity. It's not much more of a problem. And that brings me to the last point, which is the question. I think we've failed in the state-building exercise in Afghanistan because I very clearly remember in 2002 in August, from Jalalabad airport all the way to Surkhurud district, which is a long distance, President Karzai actually got on an open-top vehicle and waved all the way down to that district from the Jalalabad airport, and people hugged him, people welcomed him. So it's very hard to see even a very low-level commander doing that today. But that was the president at the time, and people welcomed him because they saw him as a figure who could unite the country. So don't you think, the question is to both Ben and to Arvind, don't you think that the state-building exercise, in fact, has been a copycat model from the Western policymakers pretty much, without a say from the local population in Afghanistan, from the young people? I remember people campaigning for the Loy Jirga voluntarily. A lot of young people, they actually went out, they did education exercises, how to vote and all that. But a lot of those young people, I know they've run away from Afghanistan, they left it. So don't you think the state-building exercise in itself has been a failure? And when we reflect, we not only should reflect on the military side, but actually on this particular point as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And the last question is the lady. Yes, please.
My name is Pallavi Raghavan, and I'm a PhD student at Cambridge. And actually, it's been answered to some extent already, but I was wondering if the panel could historicize the nature of relations between India and Pakistan and Afghanistan. And I was wondering if the nature of relations between the three, is it foreseen to be qualitatively different after the withdrawal of NATO troops, or is it likely to settle back into a stable but uneasy kind of relationship that existed in the 50s and 60s?
Thank you. Let me.
Relationship between
India, Pakistan, do you want to start, Subi?
No, I think I did hint at this state-building exercise. Probably you were right. Afghanistan has been a war-torn society for a long time, and the constitution that was put up, it is highly centralized. Perhaps it does not reflect the way Afghanistan has governed itself for such a long time. So perhaps there is a need to look at those institutions of state, and particularly governance. But that requires a certain amount of political process, some peace, etc. Because the situation, if the security situation is not good, then the state building is not going to take place that easily. So yes, there could be models which from outside which might have been imposed, and this is actually a criticism which has come from the Afghans themselves. About this India, Afghanistan, Pakistan, I think the history is a very old history. As I said, that in the undivided India, there was a close relationship between Afghanistan and India, and we have the narrative of the frontier Gandhi who fought in the Indian independence struggle, and he had a great regard. He was regarded highly in the Pashtun areas, etc. And he was one of the stalwarts of the Indian freedom struggle. So the relationship between Indians and Afghans has been there. But of course, if you go even further, there's been tensions also have been there. There have been attacks and there have been counterattacks and there have been expansions of the rulers going into Afghanistan, etc. So you find that this area has been in great flux. And I think that flux is exactly what we are seeing. It will probably remain in flux. Outsiders have come and gone, starting from Alexander, but the area has remained in flux. And I think to that extent, it is really the Afghans or the people of the region. And that's why the importance of the regional countries and regional consensus becomes very important. The post-2015, I think it is also an opportunity. One should not always see it only as a crisis. It's also an opportunity for India, Afghanistan, and Pakistan to work together and see that several things can be done together, for instance. One way to stabilize Afghanistan, as many people have talked about, is really strengthening its economy and particularly bringing in connectivity. Now, what better to connect Afghanistan with the Pakistan economy and with the Indian economy? If we simply had a better systems and better, less of suspicion, etc. Today, the Afghan trucks come to the Indian borders, but they can't take anything back. Now, this is something that can be done. A lot of Indian aid which has gone to Afghanistan, even like biscuits, for instance, were not allowed to go via Pakistan. So I think there are so many things that we can do. India has a huge experience, a developmental experience. For instance, we have all kinds of schemes which are today directed at the poor people. Now, Afghanistan, many of these schemes can be, whether it is in the area of education, whether it's in health or infrastructure and so many other things. Probably Afghanistan being a small country, instead of spending so much money on security, if even part of this could have been used to, let's say, bring a good mid-day meal scheme in Afghanistan's, let's say, the 30 provinces, etc., things would have been better. But the Western model was totally different. You had very highly expensive experts coming and taking probably all the assistance back in terms of salary, etc., not routing it through the Afghan government. That was another mistake. So there are many, many models which exist in the region, and I'm sure in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, in Central Asia, there are many such schemes. But none of this has been given a try because the entire discourse has been totally from the Western, Western dimensions. Now, one idea which I think, I do not know, I'm not an expert, but supposing you have this issue of drugs, instead of in the early years when there were spraying being done and the farmers being coerced into stopping drugs, etc., supposing there were a scheme where you could buy every single gram of opium that was being produced in Afghanistan and taken for medicinal purposes, it would have been cheaper than putting all this money in. Supposing you had 10 or 15 years program of buying all the drugs, every single gram, giving good compensation to the farmers, and gradually weaning them away to some other more productive schemes, things could have been worked better. India has given many suggestions in the past. India has, for instance, talked about a non-aligned Afghanistan, a neutral Afghanistan, and collective guarantees, etc. But India was not the part of a discourse, despite the fact that so much assistance, etc., was going. India simply did not have a voice because ISF came in a certain way. Pakistanis were very concerned about Indian presence, even of our socio-economic assistance. So India was simply kept out and it all became bilateral. So I think there is a lot that needs to be learned over the last 10 years, what has gone right, what has gone wrong, and then perhaps in a dispassionate way, as the Colonel was saying, we should sit together and see what is the way ahead. But it has to be some regional.
Thank you.
I'll try and take these questions in chronological order in terms of the substance. The question on state building. There's a very good analysis written by a Scandinavian lady academic whose name escapes me, but called Less is More, that is very persuasive about what went wrong with state building. But it appears there was far too much of an effort to impose Western models and norms, although many nations, Afghans and President Karzai would say, behave badly by saying, if you don't enact this particular law or allow this particular program, we'll take away our aid. But I think the more important reason, actually, is this was the unexpected consequence of the Iraq War and the way the US and other nations became embroiled in the conflict. Because a lot of oxygen, intellectual horsepower, development effort, military and security effort, that if applied to Afghanistan could have really helped get the country going in the right direction, was sucked up by Iraq. But we are where we are. Hamid's points about a couple of security weaknesses that I obviously didn't cover. I mean, I think Iraq is quite interesting because in the last couple of years the US was in Iraq. As overall security improved, they put an enormous effort into an interagency approach to helping the Iraqis improve their own border security and also building the capacity of the Iraqi Air Force. And it seems to me we're likely to see a similar effort with Afghan border security forces and the Afghan Air Force. The business about armies drawing lots of people, for lots of their recruits from areas of high unemployment or people with financial difficulties, well, that applies to most Western armies. That's not meant to be a trivial point, but the other point is that the plan is, the NATO plan, is that at some stage after 2015, the Afghan army will downsize. Now, quite clearly, that's going to be quite a difficult judgment to make. But I think it will have a positive effect on Afghanistan because an awful lot of people have received really quite serious literacy, numeracy, and all sorts of other training and education that they otherwise wouldn't have. And the key trick is, can they then put these skills in the service of the Afghan private or public sector? The long-term question about the trilateral relationship between India, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. Well, they have shared interests in prosperity, security, and stability, as for that matter, do Russia, China, and Iran. But of course, India's relationship with Pakistan is going to be a factor that distorts this from the ideal. But I just return to the point I made about Afghan security, Afghan transition, that actually the political transition is going to be as important as the security transition. So the way the 2014 election plays out and the attitudes, effectiveness, and priorities of President Karzai's successor are really a very important known unknown that will have an effect on the triangular relationship.
Thank you. Well, I'm not going to sum up at all the discussion we've had, but I think we've had a very rich discussion. There have been several perspectives. Clearly, no consensus on those perspectives, but I think the very fact that we've been able to look at some of the key issues that we will be confronted with as we go into the next 24 months, to me that is something that's been of particular use for this session and for the discussion, and also equally important, the presentation by both our speakers. So I'd like to thank both our speakers and all of you for your comments and your questions, and invite you to lunch, which is just beyond the doors, which will open in the next few seconds. Thank you very much. Thank you.